Okay. Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Extremely excited for today's guest. Technically, we should have probably figured out a way to get her into counter programming month, but so be it. Claire Lehmann is the founder of Quillette, which is a fantastic publication. Very Dispatchian in some of its priors, but it beat us to the punch in existence. So we have to give credit where due. They also have a podcast that goes by the same name. We'll put all that in the show notes. And of course, to the excitement of to legions, Claire is now a contributor to the Dispatch, which we are extremely excited about. And because she's in Australia, it's true that people do actually live there. It's not made up. It's not fake news. This was extremely difficult to get on the book. So I'm talking to her. She's lovely, talented, bright-eyed, and bushy-tailed. And I am this giant unmade bed of a man at the end of a very long day. And so desperate was I to speak to Claire that I agreed to postpone cocktail hour so I could do this. So it's 6:30 here, and it's like February in Australia in the morning. Claire, welcome to the Remnant.
Thanks for having me, Jonah. It's an absolute pleasure.
I was just rereading your great piece from a couple of weeks ago for us about Zohran Mamdani and the possibility that wokeness is not so much over as mutating.
Yeah.
I am sympathetic, but I have some quibbles. But why don't you make your case first, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, well, I made an argument that was similar to another article I wrote for you guys about women radicalizing, so young, educated women radicalizing. And in that article, I wrote that there's a cultural, wokeness is a cultural energy, and it moves from one movement to the next quite swiftly. So one movement may become exhausted. So if you look at the history of this phenomenon that we call wokeness, it sort of moved from feminism, sort of originated in 2014 with pop feminism, and then it moved into perhaps climate with Greta Thunberg's school strikes, and then moved into Black Lives Matter. And so my argument in the article on women was that young women in particular, are the drivers of wokeness, and there are various reasons for that, but we need to understand it as not a set of fixed or literal political positions, but a cultural energy. And it's sort of, just because one movement may become fatigued or exhausted doesn't mean it's going to go away altogether. There'll be another movement that sort of crops up and the energy will flow back into it. And so the argument that I made in the piece about Mamdani is that I do think the next wave of activism for young people, in particular young women, will be economic leftism. So we've seen the identity causes sort of exhaust themselves, the feminism, the racial issues, even transgender activism. But the next wave really might be an attack on sort of free market capitalism and so on. And what is underpinning all of this is a sort of a Manichean worldview that pits the world into the oppressors versus the oppressed. And you can see it with, there's various survey data showing that young people are quite sympathetic to populist economic left-wing policy positions. And then there's combined that with the lack of historical knowledge about communism and what has happened in places where it's been tried. I think, it sets the stage for a next wave of wokeism to be a little bit more scary than past waves.
So I tend to agree, but how do I put this? So one of my sort of hobby horses is how there are very, very, very few new ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, what happens is that a lot of people, because of the historical ignorance that you're talking about, latch on to stuff that is probably more properly understood as part of our, to be colloquial, part of our lizard brains, right? I mean, like there's a certain aspect of socialism that is just tribalism, and we have a sweet tooth for it, and we come up with, every generation comes up with a new name or new kind of bogus argument to make it sound like it's this fresh and exciting idea, when in reality it's the same old crappy idea. And so one of the things that I think my problem with the term wokeness, we got to call it something. So I got no problem. Like, let's call it wokeness, right? When I was going through college, it was called political correctness. And then, you know, you can go back and find other terms for it. But can't you make the case that there is something in terms of the role of women? And you did this great piece about the radicalization of women, which we were really glad to have. But like, if you go back and you read the progressive feminists of the 1920s, Charlotte Perkins Gilman and all these kinds of people, they're saying some bat guano crazy stuff too about, you know, getting rid of the private ownership of children, and they're the ones who took all our booze away, and all of these kinds of things. And can't you just make the case that the radical pose or the radical instinct, which I think is often a mask for much more reactionary ideas than the radicals realize, isn't it just sort of baked into human existence? And right now we're obsessed with wokeness, and in 10 years we'll say, remember wokeness? That was easy compared to this new crap that we're dealing with. But that's just sort of baked into the cake, and it's part of the human condition.
No, I would agree with that. And no, I think you're right in that it's baked into our human nature and human societies, because it's just part, political extremism is just part of, the tapestry of human nature. I think what's different and what's been blindsided many of us is how quickly movements rise and fall due to the power of social media. So social media has really, we've always had radical movements, and we shouldn't forget how radical the 1960s were, obviously. But the way in which, so if you think of a certain subset of the population, say 2 to 5% being quite extremist and radical, like the subset of a university population, it's all of the people in the middle who don't have strong views, who sort of get cowed into submission and into going along with the trendy cause or the trendy narrative, which is, circulating at the time. I think the speed at which the moderate people, the people in the middle, get cowed and sort of subdued into conformity happens much more quickly now because of social media. And that's the key to understanding how that happens, is understanding how women operate in their friendship groups and online. So women, particularly young women, are in their friendship groups, they're more attuned to harmony, social consensus. And so you're more likely to see girls agreeing with other girls in their social groups on causes that they might not actually truly believe in, just to get along with their friends, to go along with the crowd. And so the idea is that because we've got this machinery or this engine for social conformity, which is social media, and because we're placing so many young people through these ideological indoctrination centers, which is the universities, we're getting this sort of engine for activism. And, I think it's still early days. Yeah, I agree with you. We'll probably look back on wokeness as being this quaint, somewhat harmless cultural. And it might not even be left wing. We can see social media deranging and distorting the right wing as well, particularly in the United States. And so the idea isn't just to say, this extreme left wing ideology, is immovable or unshakable. The real point underlying it is that social media is giving these radical ideologies a lot of fuel, and we don't yet know how to deal with it.
Yeah, I struggle with this because, it's been, I'm very interested in the history of populist upheaval, and basically every mass communication technology since the printing press has come with a mass populist uprising, and
Mm-hmm.
you can't really understand the Protestant Reformation without the printing press.
Yeah.
And radio is probably responsible for most of the populist upheaval of the 1930s in Europe. Maybe you still get Hitler without radio, but it's the mass communication aspect of it is huge. The 1960s protest culture was partly because the kids were right when they were screaming the whole world is watching, because the whole world was watching. And people tend to be stupider when they're being watched by when they have an opportunity to be performative. And the thing I struggle with, and it sounds like you do too, is we've always been able to sort of adjust and adapt to the technological breakthroughs because there was enough of a adjustment period after them. I mean, we had a long time after the printing press to sort of get used to the idea of mass literacy. The pace of innovation with the social media stuff is so much faster than I think the natural sort of antibodies of a society can deal with. And so I just have no idea how to predict its direction.
Well, I think we are developing antibodies at the moment. I mean, you can see today that, corporations are resisting attempts to, deplatform and cancel people. There was this big outcry when Sydney Sweeney had that ad with the good genes, and what was American Eagle doubled down on it. So it's taken 5 years, and it's taken it hasn't taken that long for corporations to realize that they don't have to cave in every time there's some kind of social media outrage. But you're right, and that the technology isn't stagnating. Who knows what AI is going to do to our lizard brains with the fake images and the fake videos. And we can see, and another aspect of social media that I don't think we fully understand or have grappled with is to what extent are foreign agents or hostile foreign powers manipulating us through these platforms, these communications technologies.
I was trying to find this quote. There's this great quote from, it's not Montesquieu, but it's someone like that, who says, if the task was only to be happy, it would be pretty easy, but people want to be happier than other people. And that's happier than they think other people are.
Yeah.
And that's impossible. And that's the problem. A big chunk of the problem with social media is it's telling you constantly, this is part of the point in your Mamdani thing, is it's constantly telling people who are in the 1% that they're poor if they're not in the 0.0001%.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about that I think is very difficult. That if you're talking about the kind of woke economic populism that Mamdani represents, I think social media is perfectly primed to fuel that. And it's getting corporations to reject cancel culture doesn't get at what it does to the average, elite kid who can't get a good job and is wildly resentful about it.
Yeah, the downwardly mobile. That's right. We have a huge problem in Australia with the cost of housing. And I don't see, particularly for people my age and younger, I don't see how that doesn't lead to a populist backlash if young people cannot afford to buy a home, even when they're earning above a median salary. If they cannot afford to buy a home or even rent a home in the city in which they work, I don't see how that, long term, I don't see how that does not result in a populist backlash. And I can understand why the left, the sort of rent control, the anti-landlord, anti-capitalist rhetoric, I understand why that is becoming more popular in Australia. I mean, Australia is we're quite politically apathetic. People don't get worked up very easily. But I can definitely understand and sympathize with young people who are becoming more receptive to that socialist rhetoric. I just worry that if reforms don't happen soon, that we will get to a point where some really ghastly policies are put in place to sort of rectify this problem, whether it's rent controls or whether it's, taxes on unrealized capital gains and so on. I mean, I think that's the path we're going to be heading down in Australia, simply because there are these structural problems in our economy and society that haven't been dealt with by successive governments.
So let me ask you a question. So I agree with that, and we have similar problems in the States. But one of the advantages that the United States has is, we have enough major cities that you can move to one of those cities and solve, I have a good friend of mine in London. I talk to him about this a lot. One of the problems that the UK has is that it just has London, basically, right? It doesn't, and like, if you want to be successful in any industry in the UK, you basically have to live in London, not Manchester or Leeds or any of those kinds of places. So it's actually having a depressive cultural effect on young people who figure, even if I worked twice as hard and made 50% more, I still couldn't afford to live anywhere I want to live. And so why bother? And I should just have this sort of cafe society kind of life, or get involved in sort of radical politics. In America, like, if New York isn't working for you, there's Chicago. Chicago's not working for you. There's Kansas City. There's San Francisco. There's LA. All these places have problems, but there's enough capacity to deal with some of that in a way that, and so I'm just kind of curious, in Australia, I mean, there's Sydney. It's not as concentrated in terms of that problem, but it feels like it might be more so than it is the States.
I think we would have a similar situation to the UK in that even though we have this gigantic landmass, we're a very urban population, and we have had quite astronomical immigration over the past 5 or so years after COVID, and it's all been to Sydney and Melbourne. So all of this population growth is putting tremendous pressure on the local infrastructure. We've just recently had sort of an anti-immigration rally, whether it was last weekend or the weekend before. And so this is kind of the resentment that has been building in Europe is now bubbling up here in Australia as well. It's sort of taken a while, and it's like we're on this sort of it's like a delay. What's happening in UK seems to be happening here. But you're absolutely correct. The problem with Australia is the lack of mid-sized cities with amenity. And I've wondered why this is the case, because obviously we have enough land, but I've been told that the issue in Australia is not enough water to sustain many other large hubs of population. So apparently it's an issue with not having enough water. But you would think that there could be some technological solutions for that.
Yeah, I mean, if the Emirates can create giant desalination plants, but
exactly.
Yeah, so it's funny. I once looked it up. People don't actually appreciate how, and I say this as just a passionate Anglophile. I love the UK, but it is so much poorer than the United States. That if so the second richest city per capita basis, I looked it up. I think it was Manchester, but whatever city it was, to get the same per capita income for a city in the United States, you have to go to, like, I think Brownsville, Texas, or something like that. Which is like 300th on the list of American cities in terms of per capita income. And, our poorest state is Mississippi is now wealthier on a per capita basis than the UK. And so in some ways the comparisons get kind of difficult to make, both for good reason, for things in ways that reflect poorly on us, and things that reflect poorly on UK, because it's just, we're kind of living in different universes.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask you a question. So I, for years, was a real skeptic of what, at least in the States, we call horseshoe theory. I assume you guys have a similar term, right? In part because when I wrote my first book, at least, the right in America was so dogmatically committed to constitutionalism, free markets, small government, gun rights, First Amendment, free speech rights. It was pretty. The ideological consensus on the right was pretty profound on these things, and I thought fairly unshakable. And so it always seemed to me to be something of a slander to say the further right you get, the closer you get to the left. If you define the right in the Anglo-American context as like limited government and free markets and all these kinds of things, you can't get more classically liberal and turn into a totalitarian, right?
Yes. They're on different axes.
Yeah. The problem now is I reluctantly have to come around to horseshoe theory because so much of the new right, what some people call the woke right, have given up on the liberalism part. And then once you're illiberal, it's not particularly the differences between the illiberal left and the illiberal right. The language is different. The cultural cues are different. The
people they want to lock up might be different.
Yeah, the people they hate are different. But the structural arguments,
the attack on institutions appears to be the same.
And the role of economics, which is sort of one of the things that you were getting into, is fairly the same. It's just they want to pick different winners and losers, but it's still about the government picking winners and losers. In Australia, was your right a classical liberal right for the most part to begin with?
Yeah.
Is the same sort of thing happening over there?
Yeah, definitely. Our centre-right party is called the Liberal Party, and a lot of liberals would be considered Democrats in the US system because how that we're the liberals brought in gun control and they protect universal healthcare and so on. So we just sort of have to. The reference points are somewhat different, but the centre-right party, the Liberal Party, is explicitly classically liberal. The difference between the centre-left party, which is the Labor Party, is that they're for free markets and more deregulation of the economy, whereas the Labor Party, the hint is in the name, they're aligned with the unions. And so it's that old 20th century sort of divide between capital and labour. There is tension now between the Liberal Party, who are seen by many on the right as being too pro-immigration, too mealy-mouthed on cultural issues. When big corporations such as the mining giants were putting out diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and statements, sort of the Liberal Party didn't have anything to say about it. They haven't had much to say about crime gangs in Victoria running rampant. So these cultural issues where people are feeling that there's a bit of a vacuum of leadership and conversation, these are becoming now flashpoints or issues of tension where we don't really have an alternative. We don't really have a populist party. There are a few populist members of parliament, such as Pauline Hanson, Bob Katter, but there isn't a movement that would resemble what exists in the UK with the Reform Party and Nigel Farage. But I think that's probably on the horizon for Australia. If the Liberal Party choose to sort of cede policy or cede any kind of leadership, if they want to sort of avoid the immigration issue rather than tackle it head on, I think that we will end up seeing a populist party such as Reform emerge in Australia.
What was the genesis? Because for years, Australia had this reputation of being pretty restrictionist on immigration.
Yeah.
Was there a specific argument that caused this massive influx of immigration that won the day, or was it something that was done over the heads of voters?
It appears to be, no, there wasn't a specific argument. It appears to have been driven by our universities who, we have these big universities in Australia that have, you would have the equivalent in the United States, but education is like our third biggest export industry. So we've got hundreds of thousands of international students coming to our big universities. And there's just been sort of like policy roundtables, sort of committees and meetings before, during, and after COVID between business leaders and university administrators, pushing for higher caps on skilled immigration, university students, and that, it wouldn't be a problem. It's just that Australia is still a small country and we still have limited infrastructure. And when the equivalent of the Sydney of Brisbane or the Sydney of Hobart are arriving in 1 year, there just isn't the capacity to scale up standards of living to accommodate everyone. And, I'm actually a proponent of a big Australia. I think our population should be growing. I would like to see a very large, powerful Australian nation in the future. I just think it has to be managed in a way that doesn't mean that for people already living here, their standards of living decline. And that's what's been happening since COVID. And I think something similar has happened in Canada as well.
Yeah, I mean, Canada is its own other thing. Before I switch topics, I got to ask something. I always ask this of Australian people, and I always get different answers. The typical English accent or the typical American accent, which sounds more familiar to you or more exotic?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think the American accent sounds more familiar because I hear it more in the entertainment that I consume and the podcasts I consume. But when I go to England, it feels very familiar, and culturally it feels very familiar. So I think Australians we are a colony of Britain, a more recent colony of Britain. So I think that the British accent is, I've heard the Australian accent be described as a British accent that is slurred. So if you imagine the British colonists coming here being drunk on rum the whole time, that's how the Australian accent came to be. And I think there's something to that.
Well, it would make a bunch of criminals getting drunk. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
So I had a friend at my old cigar shop who was an Australian attaché to the embassy, and one of the things he said to me was that Australians and Texans have the most cultural similarities insofar as their relationships to the larger kind of culture. That Australia is sort of the Texas of the British Empire. Yeah, there's something about that that sounds right to me.
Yeah, definitely. If you compare Queenslanders, particularly North Queenslanders, so there's a politician called Bob Katter who represents North Queensland, and he wears a big hat, and he's an Australian Texan, and the people who live in North Queensland, they run farms. They still have rodeos up there. There is a lot of cultural overlap, and the sort of the lack of pretension, the down to earth, and the friendliness. All of that is there in the Queenslanders, but I don't think people down in Melbourne would be very similar to Texans. I think they would be more similar to your Portlandians or Seattle folk.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to stipulate up front: love Barry Weiss, Free Press. They're kindred spirits in many ways. We do slightly different things, but I wish them all the best in the world. I was always a skeptic, and I wrote as much at the time when Barry wrote her big intellectual dark web piece for the New York Times back then. And as I recalled, I just checked to make sure that you were name checked in it. And in my skepticism at the time was that there really was no major intellectual through line to all of the names in it. It was, except that it was largely a bunch of contrarians, and that's fine. But I'm something of a contrarian myself from time to time. The problem with it was trying to make it a network of kindred spirits, right? And that there was some ideological plot that united all of these people. And if you go back and you look at it now, Candace Owens is named in there, but so is Steven Pinker. And so my point is like contrarianness by itself covers a really diverse bunch of people. You are not Candace Owens, right? And there are some people who have gone into total like conspiracy theory nuttiness, and there are other people who are like utterly respectable and admirable public intellectuals. And at the time it felt like these are people Barry finds very interesting who are outside of the very narrow and stifling consensus at the New York Times. And I salute her for having a robust Rolodex. But in retrospect, it feels to me like the whole concept of the intellectual dark web, which was kind of served as a kind of intellectual just so story for a lot of the stuff that then blew up during COVID and all of these kinds of things, has not aged very well. And I'm kind of wondering, do you have an explanation or a theory of the case about why some people have gone into nuttery, anti-Semitic nuttery, anti-vax nuttery, and other people didn't? Is it just boil down to the different personalities of people? Is it some people are more susceptible to the seductions of social media stardom? I mean, what's your theory of the case?
No, I think fragility in the face of social media stardom is definitely a big factor. I don't think we are designed to be, if you're a professor, for example, at a community college or any college, and you've had your whole career just being known by people on campus, and then suddenly you're a household name, virtually overnight. Not only that, but people online are calling you a Nazi and are being horrible to you 24 hours a day. I mean, that's got to cause a great deal of stress. And so I think, like I studied psychology at university, but one thing that psychologists haven't really studied much is the impact of fame or rapid fame on people, and what personality traits are buffers or protectors. And I think fame is very dangerous, and I think it helps if people get to a point where they're famous gradually. So if you look at people who work in politics, often they decide to go into the job and it takes years for them to reach a level of stardom. And then they have a staff around them, they have speech writers and they have media advisors, they have an entire team. If it's just one individual and they don't have a team around them looking out for their best interests and keeping them on message, it can be I imagine it can be very daunting. I mean, even for me, I'm not nearly at the level of celebrity as people like Brett Weinstein or Jordan Peterson, but I did go through a period where I was being called a Nazi, and big publications in the United States were printing quite horrible things about me, and it was stressful. So I can imagine that kind of stress does lead people into sort of vulnerable situations where they sort of cling on to whatever tribe is protecting them. So there's definitely a psychological component. I think another component is epistemological. So I had a conversation with Coleman Hughes a couple of years ago after COVID, and he said to me that he noticed about the so-called intellectual dark web that some people in it, like he mentioned Eric Weinstein, they were always conspiratorial. Even before COVID, they had always looked at the world from this kind of, there are players we can't quite see. There are shadowy players sort of doing things behind the scenes. And we both talked about how we came to criticize movements such as, in my case, it was feminism. In his case, it was racial activism. We came to criticize those movements because we thought they were conspiratorial. I thought the concept of the patriarchy had conspiratorial undertones. He thought the concept of white supremacy had conspiratorial undertones. So we came from our criticism of left-wing orthodoxy or liberal orthodoxy was an epistemological critique. We thought there's not enough evidence for these theories to be as popular or as mainstream as they currently are. Whereas other people came to a point other people were criticizing cultural orthodoxies from a conspiratorial point, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's just different ways of thinking and ways of knowing, I think, is how you could go back to that intellectual dark web article published in the New York Times, and you could probably group people according to how empirical or positivist they are in their way of thinking, and how sort of vibe-based or impression-based others are.
Yeah, I think your point about fame is really important. I was at National Review for 20 years, and I would see it all. And before that, I was, in the American Enterprise Institute and other places in Washington, and you would see it repeatedly where young people would write one article that had a splash or did something that had them in the news for a little while, and you could tell, like the addict who just has to chase the high. And the problem is that you start chasing the notoriety rather than the substance that gives you the notoriety.
Yeah.
And an enormous number of people, I've known an enormous number of young people who were ruined by being famous too early.
Right.
And
like child actors.
Yeah, for sure. Like there was this, this horrible church shooting here about 10 days ago. And there was this just absolutely heart-wrenching, charming little boy who talked about how he put himself in front of his friend, and like he's worried, or his friend put himself in front of him, and he handled himself with incredible composure being asked about this horrible thing. And I immediately turned to my wife, literally brushing tears off my cheeks, saying, God, I hope they never interview him again. Because you don't want this little kid to become famous and crave that kind of feedback at that age. There are a lot of people who were had moments of heroism that make them national stars for for a minute. And then when the spotlights go away, they get all cold, and the phone stops ringing, and it can really ruin people. The other dynamic, which I think you're right about, is, and it jibes with, Pappy Cannon was a family friend. And I've long argued that young Pappy Cannon would be heartbroken to find out that old Pappy Cannon was saying, Churchill was the real villain of World War II and all the other crazy stuff that he says. But part of what I think happened was, I'm not saying that Pat didn't have wrong ideas about some things going all the way back, but he used to take much greater care in not sounding anti-Semitic or sounding cranky. And he still got so viciously attacked that the only positive and supportive feedback he got were from people saying, give him hell, Pat, you're not going far enough, really unleash the next time, that kind of thing. And so my advice to young writers has been for a very long time, if you're not willing to every now and then disappoint your biggest fans, then you're going to get owned by them, and you're going to start to turn into a caricature, because they're just going to want you to keep playing the greatest hits and doing the shtick that they love. And that's why so many social media influencers, get stuck in this rut where they have to come up with the next conspiracy because that's what the audience demands of them.
Yeah. Well, any career and any media organization, for that matter, that relies on social media is going to be fragile for that reason. When I started Quillette, we did rely on social media. It was our method of distribution. And when I started, it was, Twitter in particular was dominated mostly by left-wing journalists, and there was a real orthodoxy. So we really were able to cut through, and there wasn't that much competition at the time. But now we've been going for a decade. We find that we get very little traffic from social media. Well, not as much traffic from social media. It all comes from Google search. So people are searching, various topics, and they'll come to our website because we publish so much on film reviews, book reviews, music reviews, and so on. And it gives us a lot of freedom to not chase those eyeballs and clicks that are on social media. And as you would know, there was a study that came out recently showing that the center basically doesn't even exist on social media. All of the impressions, all of the influence is the far left and the far right. So it's really hard to compete in that environment. And, you know, anyone being true to themselves and being reasonable and centrist ends up becoming attacked from both sides. So you really have to have extraordinary thick skin on one hand, or just ignore it on the other hand. And so I think if people really, consider, imagine there'll be an influencer and become famous on social media, and their whole career and their whole enterprise will be driven by social media. I mean, that's a really fragile path to take.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're working on a piece about anti-vax stuff migrating from left to right.
Well, I wrote a short piece for the Australian newspaper that was published over the weekend, in light of the news that Florida was scrapping vaccine requirements. And I've just been fascinated since the rise of the Maha movement. I've been really fascinated about how this sort of the hippie left sort of vaccine denial has shifted from being a left-wing thing to a right-wing thing. And in thinking about it more and reading about it more, I realized it hasn't really shifted, it's just merged. Mm-hmm. So in Australia, we have a community up in Nimbin, which is Nimbin is an old hippie town. And if you go there, there's a lot of hard drug use. I mean, it's very hippie, like it's hardcore hippie, and that's, if we ever have a measles outbreak, that's where it happens. And I think in the United States, when you've had measles outbreaks, it's been in the more white affluent areas, you know, not mm-hmm. in places where you've got, not in classically or traditionally right-wing enclaves. But I think what's happened is someone like RFK Jr., who was of the left, he was this environmental activist. He did lobby to get Indian Point shut down. He did, he was this ambulance chasing lawyer who sued corporations. He has merged the sort of purity concerns of the affluent, organic food base, the crunchy left. He's merged those purity concerns with the concerns of the more libertarian-minded right, who, for many reasonable reasons, have reacted very badly to the impositions that COVID brought about, and see vaccination, particularly mandates, as an authoritarian imposition. So it's sort of, he's fused these two concerns into one broad-scale rejectionist movement. And I just think he's quite an interesting activist and cultural entrepreneur, because I don't think it's been done before.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very generous description of what a guy I consider to just essentially be a dangerous crackpot. But I agree with you. I mean, so one of the only times that Trump's poll numbers actually noticeably went up in the lead up to the 2024 election was when Kennedy endorsed him. And that's one of the reasons why Trump won't let go of him, is because he was actually additive to his coalition. There were legitimate new people brought in to the fold. And I think that you're right, that the people who liked Kennedy were kind of transpartisan. Like they cut across sort of orthogonally or whatever across the normal ideological landscape. And so you could have hippies of both the sort of peace and love and the Charles Manson type who loved him. And you could have the sort of more high end kind of Santa Monica hippie, body shop hippie kind of person. Right. And I think it's incredibly regrettable that what's happened. But so you mentioned the purity thing. Jonathan Haidt is the guy who convinced me in that in the Righteous Mind to think about. I'm a fan of evolutionary psychology. I don't think it's as all explanatory as people, the real devotees, want it to be. But I think it's always a useful way to think about something for a little bit, and then you think of all the reasons why it doesn't explain everything. But one of the things that he was really great on is how the parts of your brain that are worried about cleanliness and purity and disease are deeply tied up with the parts about morality, and that they can like misfire with each other. And when you think about the language about immigrants, poisoning our blood and all that kind of stuff, and you think about the ways in which COVID made people crazy, the anti-vax stuff kind of gets a little more clarifying in terms of the sort of, again, the lizard brain stuff about it. I know I keep coming back to lizard brain stuff, but I just find so much of the ideological stuff that I mean, this is like the only place of real friction is that with the stuff you read about woke, because I think programmatically I agree with you, nearly 95, 100% on it, but like descriptively, I think so much of our ideological arguments these days are pretextual. They're after the fact rationalizations of a much more sort of Nietzschean kind of will to power. I want my stuff, so let me grab some stupid ideas off a shelf and put them around it. And so it's one of the reasons why I get so frustrated arguing about intellectual stuff or political stuff these days is I lack a lot of interlocutors that I actually disagree with, who I think are arguing in good faith. And I think that's one of the main, when you're talking about the splits with the intellectual dark web about who went where and who went in, the people who stayed sane and stayed people I care about or care about their opinion, they still think facts matter, right? They still think an argument matters, and an enormous number of them don't, right? The classic conspiracy theory way of thinking about things is you reach your conclusion first and then you reason backwards, grabbing whatever convenient facts you can stick on it to make it plausible. And there's just an enormous amount of that crap on both the left and the right these days.
The one way I've come to think about it is if you go back to John Haidt's moral foundations theory, and he's got the 5 foundations: the purity, the care, liberty, authority. I can't remember the other one off the top.
You did better than me.
But each of these moral foundations, when they're in balance and when they're not taken to an extreme, they're all really important. It's when these foundations, our instincts for whether it's care or whether it's purity, it's when they're taken to extremes that it becomes a problem and deranging. So if you think about the care foundation, obviously we have evolved an instinct for care because we look after our infants and children. We have to raise our children. They're not born ready to go out into the world and just operate. So we look after our children, and that evolutionary history has endowed us with this tremendous care instinct, which is on average stronger in women than men. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a problem if it gets to the point where we start caring about Hamas terrorists, and we start caring more about the schizophrenic on the train than the poor girl who ends up being a victim of a violent crime. So, and then if you take the purity foundation, I mean, it's obviously it's adaptive and protective for us to not eat food that is old or moldy, and it's adaptive for us to have certain rules about cleanliness. But then if we're taking it to the point where we're demonizing new immigrants for being dirty or unclean, or if we're taking it to the point where we're demonizing life-saving technologies such as vaccines because there's a trace of mercury which has been shown to be harmless, but if we're just imagining that it's going to have this long-term harm because of because our purity instinct is going haywire. That's the problem. And so, you know, and then the same thing with liberty. You know, of course we want to, of course it's adaptive for us to have an instinct for liberty, but when it gets to the point where we're arguing that, you know, there should be no government at all and defund the police and everything, you know, let's just get rid of the state, then obviously we're, you know, regressing back into anarchy. So the way I think of it is just that it's when our instincts for moral positions become exaggerated or extreme, or when other concerns don't come into the equation at all. When we're only focused on care and we don't think about other aspects that have to keep society working and chugging along. But I notice on social media that almost everything I see is people being performative, performing one moral instinct to its absolute extreme. And that's how they get the adulation and the likes and the retweets and all.
It's very Burkean, right? The essence of Burke is any principle can go wrong when taken to an extreme, right?
Yeah, But the principle itself is good.
It's good, yeah, for sure. Right? Yeah. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, I mean, I've been arguing for 30 years that conservatism was, its great strength was that it was willing to, its comfort with contradiction. That conservatism understands that you can take the preference for freedom so far that it starts to have, it hits the point of diminishing returns, because it starts to intrude on the importance of order, right? And the whole, I know I've been heaping scorn on ideology and intellectual stuff this entire podcast, but I think one of the fundamental places where there is a real difference between left and right is what Tom Sowell called the constrained versus the unconstrained vision. And there is a tendency on the left to believe in what Samuel Huntington called the unity of goodness, that all good things can go together. You can have perfect environmental policy without any cost to growth, everything's a false choice if it means paying a price and having a trade-off. And that sort of utopianism, I think we're starting to see come out on the right. I mean, we're getting golden age rhetoric BS, you know, all the time on the right these days too.
I think on the left there is also an inability to recognize that evil exists and that that evil is part of human nature, and that some people are just bad people. I think that's a huge divider between people who are conservative and progressive. I mean, it's like a lot of people are progressive until they are a victim of crime, right?
Right. That was Irving Kristol's thing. Neoconservative is a liberal mugged by reality, right? I agree. So we're running up on time here, and I don't want to abuse my privileges, but I remember sometime around right after COVID, Emmanuel Macron, who I'm not exactly a huge fan of, but he gave some speech or had some remarks where he said that the sort of the wokeness stuff coming out of America has no place here. We're not going to do intersectionality. I mean, I can't remember the exact words, but words to that effect. And one of the things I liked about it was I thought of turnabout's fair play. The French have been exporting crappy ideas to America for so long. Turnabout's fair play. But on the flip side, I'm just kind of curious, does the wokeness stuff, does it present as an American import in Australia, or is the conversation about it purely it's homegrown and this stuff is going on in America too, but this is our problem? Or does it feel like it is sort of incepted from America?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say it's a bit of both. There's a lot of organic, homegrown sort of identity activism in Australia, particularly around gender and also Indigenous issues. And some of the activism around Indigenous issues has always been in Australia, and some of it has been infused with this sort of American Black Lives Matter language, and that's obviously, this a cultural import, but it's just a cultural import on top of activism that was already there and was already in existence. The sort of the feminist orthodox position and the gender activism has always been in Australia. Climate change is a big issue in Australia because we're quite vulnerable to extreme weather events, and so people are always terrified of, will my house get washed away by the ocean? And so climate change is huge here. But I do think that we were immune to some of the worst excesses of the Great Awakening when it was happening. When I was being attacked, for example, online and in various American publications at the height, in years 2018, 2019, 2020, I had no issues at all in Australia. I would be invited onto left-wing sort of TV shows and radio shows and so on. So it felt to me that the political polarization was much less extreme in Australia than it was in the United States, where anyone who was like vaguely associated with Trump, or anyone who wasn't, in agreement that Trump was the end of the world, was sort of like cast out as being a terrible right winger. So it feels to me that the cultural polarization is less extreme here, which gives us a bit of a protective layer or a bit of a buffer. But in general, there are a lot of these sort of progressive movements that, you would describe as being woke for sure.
Well, also, you have all these ridiculous bugs and reptiles that want to kill you there, so you only have so much time for politics. You do have a ridiculously large number of horrible, monstrous creatures in Australia.
Yeah. But everybody has a brush with either death or being maimed. I remember it was about 2 summers ago, I had to drive my husband to the emergency room. He had arterial bleeding out of his foot because he'd been stabbed by a stingray. He wasn't not quite as bad as Steve Irwin's stingray to the heart, but yeah, that's the Australian experience for you. I remember I had to call.
What is the
Sorry, I was just saying I had to call an ambulance because my son was stung by a blue bottle, but he came to after a while, so it was fine. But yeah, we do have a lot of dangerous animals.
All right, so what is the, like, forget the crocodiles. Everyone knows to be afraid of crocodiles, and forget the crazy venomous snakes. What is the critter, could be a centipede or whatever, that you are most likely to have an unpleasant run-in as a normal Australian? It doesn't necessarily have to be lethal, but just something that the tourist board doesn't want you telling.
Well, where I grew up in Adelaide, South Australia, it's the brown snake. So I came across quite a few brown snakes when I was a child. Where I live now in Sydney, it's the blue-ringed octopus. So if you go swimming... No, sorry, not the blue-ringed octopus, the blue bottle jellyfish. So if you're going into the water, you're likely to be stung by one of these blue bottles, and it hurts.
Yeah.
It hurts.
Yeah.
It hurts a lot. Yeah.
Well, one of these days I will
you won't see
finally
that
get to Australia and avoid the ocean entirely. So, Claire Lehmann, thank you so much for doing this. I'm sorry about the connection.
Good.
And do look me up next time you're in the United States. But this was great, and I hope you come back.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jonah. It's been a pleasure.